Our next speaker can't really call her a friend of Cage as much as she is Cage family. A lot goes into Cage thinking about the work that we do, the lines that we take, how we should understand the challenges that are in front of us. And Victoria Brittain has always been behind us in many ways, trying to help us, message ourselves in a way that, we can reach across wider communities. And also, really, more than that, Victoria has always shown us the way in which you speak to families and the way in which we should engage with people who are survivors of this war on terror. And her work really speaks for itself. So I'd like to ask Victoria to please come up and speak about, the impact of control orders and TPIMs on the lives of families. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. As Asim said earlier, here we are again. I can't believe that it's 10 years that we've been doing these kind of events. And every January, here we are again for another Guantanamo event. I was asked to talk about control orders. I'm going to partly talk about control orders, but what I'm really going to talk about is heroines. And I'm extremely happy that several of my heroines are in this room. And this book that I wrote about the experiences of mothers, wives, and daughters of people affected in different ways by the war on terror, Guantanamo, control orders, deportations, extraditions, is their book. And it was they who wanted me to write it. And it's their voices that are in the book. So I'm going to read some of their voices, although there's one here who could read her own voice, but I'm going to read it for her on this occasion. Although on Woman's Hour, she spoke for herself very wonderfully. Just as there are young people here who maybe 10 years ago were not on this bandwagon that we've been on, I'm just going to give you a little bit of background on control orders, which don't exist anymore. They became, 52 people were on control orders at different time. Then they became TPIMs, which was more or less the same, except they could only last for 2 years, and 10 people were on those. And those are over, but there are still plenty of people detained. And then there was the often forgotten category of deportation bail. All of these things are about house arrest. And I challenge you to say to any ordinary person in Britain how shocking it is that we have house arrest. And they will say to you, what? I never heard about it. Well, they haven't come to enough of these meetings. Anyway, house arrest with rules. So to start with giving you a little bit of context, I'm going to read a little bit out of the book. And there's one chapter in this book which is called Dina and Josephine, which is entirely about what happened to people under control orders. The control order men were all refugees from countries such as Algeria, Jordan, Palestine, Libya, or Tunisia, to which they couldn't be sent back, as it was accepted by the British that they would risk arrest, torture, or even death there. They were arrested in the UK in December 2001 as part of the post-9/11 worldwide intelligence sweep on Muslim men. They were assessed as, quotes, risks to national security and sent to Belmarsh High Security Prison in London. They mostly didn't know each other. They were products of very different cultures and educational and political experiences, and they were utterly bewildered to find themselves arrested together and linked together, suspected of links to Al-Qaeda, something which most of them had never heard of until the 11th of September 2001. They then found they were being held on secret evidence that was not even disclosed to their lawyers, and about which they were never, in the 2.5 years they were held, they were never interrogated or charged with anything. Now, most of them had come to Britain precisely because they knew about this kind of world in their own countries, and they had always thought that being in Britain, this would never happen to them again. And there's one woman in here who I remember said that being in Britain, after her husband had been very seriously tortured in Egypt, it was like a drink of cold water. They're very poetic, the women who write in this book. Anyway, so 2.5 years passed with nobody taking the slightest bit of notice of them, and they were more or less completely forgotten. But their lawyers sent in a team of psychiatrists who found 8 of the men were suffering from mental illness. 4 of them were in florid psychosis, which got them transferred to Broadmoor Mental Hospital. 3 of them, assessed by their lawyers, before their lawyers, by this team of psychiatrists, were found to have been already suffering mental health problems associated with their previous torture or their prison experiences at home. So 2 years passed before the House of Lords ruled that these foreigners could not be indefinitely imprisoned in Britain, as no British person could so be imprisoned. So the Labour government invented control orders. And these control orders were, as I've already said, a kind of house arrest. And I'm going to read a little bit from one of my favourite characters in this book, present in the room, bless you, who, when it was suggested that I might visit her husband, because I used to live in Algeria, and he was Algerian, and she was French, and I speak French, it was sort of thought that we might have stuff in common. So I applied to visit them. And in the long pause before the Home Office agreed, I spoke to her on the phone, and she said, "Oh, don't bother to wait, just come anyway. I'll meet you at the station." I said, "How will I know you?" She said, "You'll know me." And when I got to the station and I looked around, I saw a very tall, veiled woman with totally laughing eyes, waving enthusiastically as though I was her schoolmate. This is Josephine. She took me back to her house, and she'd arranged it. There was a little chair outside the house on the pavement for me, deepest winter. I was in a big coat. She sat inside the house. I wasn't allowed to do that. And we had a little stool between us where we had coffee and biscuits. And we began chatting. She began chatting. And she behaved as though we were in the most comfortable surroundings such as this. Everything was simple. Everything was easy. And as the years went on, and I did get permission, and I did go inside, I became very attracted by Josephine's manner of dealing with things. So I'm going to just read one of her stories. My first washing machine story was when I was pregnant, and we had to wait I don't know how many weeks for the man to be allowed to come and mend it when it was broken. Then when he came, my husband had to go in the other room, so he didn't see him or speak to him. My second washing machine story, however many years later, was even more crazy. They delivered the new machine early in the morning, and my husband had to tell them to leave it outside the flat, which they thought was weird, as surely somebody would take it away before the plumber came. They saw he was in a wheelchair, and they really wanted to help by bringing it in. No, thank you so much, my husband was saying to them. He was now about to explain that he was not allowed to have anyone enter without the Home Office okay. In the end, I had to push it in myself, and it was really, really heavy. I couldn't even leave it just inside the door, because then my husband's wheelchair couldn't pass. I spent the day ringing the solicitor. She needed the name of the plumber who was coming after the delivery man to get permission for the Home Office for the plumber to enter, but the plumbing company could not say which man would come. It was a stalemate. In the evening, my solicitor hired a different plumber, told the Home Office his name, and he came. And the man from the Home Office came at the same time. After all that, the man from the Home Office sat there in the living room on the sofa, never even went downstairs to see the plumber fixing the machine. We paid 2 plumbers. What was that all about? Well, what it was all about were these completely draconian and crazy rules. which changed all the time, as everyone who's ever been involved with anyone on a control order or deportation bail will know. And the heroines of this were the women who managed to treat this as completely and utterly normal. And again, I'm going to say about Josephine, but there are other women here I could say it about too, who managed to make in their homes, with all these crazy rules, and husbands who were often really in despair, they made so much happiness. And if you see their children today, independent, clever, funny, successful in sports, successful at school, this is the jewel-like gift that these women have given not only to their own families, but to everybody who knows them. And it's remarkable that many of these women are people who have helped other women who have found it even more difficult to deal with these things. I'd like to read you more bits of my book, but I'm not going to. But I want to tell you, I've been a war correspondent all my life. I've worked in places like Vietnam, Somalia, Ethiopia, all kinds of places like that, Middle East. And when 9/11 happened, I was by then living in England, and I realized this was going to be an even more confusing war than the ones I had tried to report on. And I realized the only way to understand it was to come very close to home. And when I was in all these faraway places, I always used to spend my time with refugees and particularly with women, as a way of trying to get people to understand the texture of these wars and what it meant in families. So here, it was my great privilege to be asked by Mosem to help him write his book. And we spent 8 months together working on his book. Luckily, he has a phenomenal memory, and as everybody who knows him, phenomenal self-control. And if I tell you we didn't have a single row in 8 months of working together extremely hard, that is fairly remarkable. Anyway, it was partly as a result of working with him that I came to know the wives of men who came to see Mosem. Guantanamo men, control order men, deportation men, or people who couldn't even come because of their various rules around them. And several of them wanted to talk to me about the isolation of their families. And I began visiting these families because I had never seen isolation and loneliness as there was in that period. Things are much better now, and the work of Hugs and Cage and others has meant that people don't have that absolute desolation that they used to have at that time. But I think today we're in a new period. There are a new lot of people who are afraid. And of course, I don't need to say in this room that it's all to do with Syria. But what it means is that the need for the kind of fellowship and not being afraid that those women need and will replicate with others is the kind of solidarity that is what I try to do and what many of the women here and in other places who've become my friends try to do. And when I've done talks about this book, particularly I've done them in South Africa and I've done them in America, it won't surprise you to think that I had very small audiences in America, but great people who were doing solidarity. In South Africa, I had the most enormous female audiences anybody could ever dream of. Rooms 3 times the size of this, completely packed with women. And they were all motivated by feeling, I want to do something. And I know there will be people here who will come and ask me afterwards, what can I do? Particularly young women always ask me. And I think that the 2 things I want to say is to help other people not to be afraid and not to feel that the very smallest of gestures is too small to bother with. Anybody who's baked a cake or taken a meal and left it outside the house of somebody who is in this kind of conditions is doing something that is fantastic. But the other thing about it is you have to stick with it. Asim and I are growing old here. We have been together these many years, and I'm so happy there are lots of young people, because nobody wants to be patronized by somebody coming to see them once and giving them something that they've made or thought of, and so on. Solidarity means sticking with it. And I hope that throughout all the tests and trials that so many people in this room have had and will continue to have, they can count on the fact that there are so many women who are behind them. Thank you very much.
So Victoria spoke about a lot of the heroines that we have in the homes of our brothers, you know, who have been detained, who are under control orders, who are being oppressed in so many different ways. But to be honest with you, we have heroines in many different circumstances.